Hey there. Tonight we're stepping back not to grand castles or glittering royal courts, but to the narrow, winding streets of medieval towns. The places where ordinary people lived, worked, and somehow managed to survive in conditions that would make most of us run for the hills. We're talking about the smell. The overwhelming, inescapable, absolutely horrific smell that defined medieval urban life. A mixture of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and industrial fumes that hung in the air like a permanent fog of misery. If this kind of slow, detailed history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to see who's out there falling asleep to the same quiet story. So dim the lights. Turn on a fan if you like that soft background hum. Settle in, and let's begin in a world where the very air you breathed told stories of human desperation, survival, and the daily struggle against forces no one quite understood. You wake up in a medieval town, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sound of roosters or church bells. It's the smell. A thick, suffocating wall of odor that seems to have weight, substance, personality. It's been building all night while you slept, and now it welcomes you to another day of medieval urban living. Step outside your cramped wooden house, and you're immediately immersed in a symphony of stench that would challenge even the strongest stomach. The streets themselves are the first culprit. What we generously call streets are really just narrow pathways between buildings, unpaved, uneven, and serving as the town's unofficial sewer system. There's no such thing as street cleaning, no municipal waste management, no concept that maybe, just maybe, human waste shouldn't be flowing directly through the areas where people walk, work, and live. Instead, these pathways have become rivers of filth, carrying everything from kitchen scraps to human excrement in a slow, steady flow toward whatever body of water is unfortunate enough to be downstream. The waste isn't just lying there, it's active, alive, fermenting in the medieval sun, or freezing into noxious chunks during winter. In summer, the heat transforms every pile of refuse into a bubbling cauldron of decomposition. Flies swarm in thick black clouds. Maggots writhe through the organic matter. The smell intensifies as temperatures rise, creating waves of odor that seem to pulse through the air with every breeze. In winter, things don't get better, just different. The waste freezes into hard, rank piles that turn to slippery, treacherous sludge when temperatures rise, releasing months of accumulated stench all at once. But the streets are just the beginning. Every house, every building, every structure in the medieval town contributes its own special blend to the overall aromatic experience. Most homes don't have what we'd recognize as proper sanitation. Chamber pots are emptied directly out windows into the streets below, often with little warning to anyone walking beneath. The phrase "Gardy loo," shouted from upper windows, was supposed to warn pedestrians that waste was incoming, but it didn't always provide enough time to dodge the falling filth. Inside these homes, the smell is different, but no less overwhelming. Rushes, the medieval equivalent of carpeting, cover dirt floors and soak up spills, food scraps, urine from both humans and animals, and whatever else happens to land on them. These rushes aren't changed regularly. They're expensive, and most families can't afford to replace them often. So they sit there week after week, month after month, absorbing every liquid, every spill, every accident, until they become soggy, rotting mats that squelch underfoot and release their own special perfume with every step. The walls themselves hold odors, made of wattle and daub, a mixture of wood, mud, straw, and often animal dung. They're porous and absorbent. Years of cooking smoke, human sweat, animal smells, and general living have soaked into these walls until they've become permanent repositories of stench. On humid days, the walls seem to exhale their accumulated odours, filling rooms with the ghosts of 1,000 meals, 1,000 nights of sleep, 1,000 human functions. Animals live in these towns too, and they contribute their own substantial share to the olfactory landscape. Pigs wander the streets, serving as living garbage disposals, eating whatever refuse they can find. This might sound like a practical solution, but pigs create their own waste, and their diet of rotting scraps doesn't exactly produce pleasant-smelling results. Chickens scratch around in the dirt, leaving their droppings wherever they happen to be. Dogs roam in packs, often feral, often diseased, adding their own waste, and occasionally their decomposing bodies to the mix. Horses and oxen, essential for transportation and labour, produce enormous quantities of manure. A single horse can generate up to 50 pounds of waste per day, and in a town where dozens or hundreds of these animals live and work, the mathematical reality becomes overwhelming. The manure piles up faster than it can be removed, creating mountains of fermenting horse dung that attract flies, rats, and contribute their own powerful aroma to the urban atmosphere. But we haven't even gotten to the industrial smells yet. Medieval towns are working towns, and every trade, every craft, every profession adds its own unique contribution to the sensory assault. Tanners, who prepare animal hides for leather, work with urine, feces, and decomposing flesh as part of their regular process. The smell from a tannery can be detected from miles away, a combination of rotting meat, ammonia from urine, and the chemical processes that transform raw hide into usable leather. Tanneries are often located on the outskirts of town, but in smaller settlements, they might be right in the middle of everything, sharing their aromatic gifts with every resident. Butchers contribute their own special blend of blood, offal, and decomposing meat scraps. Before refrigeration, before any real understanding of food preservation, meat goes bad quickly. The scraps and waste from butchering operations don't disappear. They pile up, rot, and attract every scavenger, insect, and disease-carrying pest in the area. The smell of a medieval butcher shop on a hot summer day is something that defies description. A combination of fresh blood, rotting flesh, and the sickly sweet odour of decay that seems to stick to everything it touches. Bakers seem like they should smell better, but even they contribute to the problem. Grain storage attracts rats and mice, whose droppings and urine contaminate flour supplies. Spoiled grain produces its own musty, sour smell, and the waste from bread production, the scraps and rejected loaves, join the general pile of organic matter decomposing in the streets. Brewers and ale makers, essential to medieval life since water is often unsafe to drink, create their own aromatic challenges. The fermentation process produces strong yeasty smells, and the waste products from brewing, the spent grain and hops, add to the general pile of rotting organic matter that characterizes medieval urban life. Metal workers and blacksmiths contribute smoke, sulfur smells, and the acrid odor of heated metals. Candle makers work with animal fat, creating their own greasy, rancid contributions to the air. Soap makers, ironically, also work with animal fats and lye, producing caustic smells that burn the nose and throat. And then there are the people themselves. Personal hygiene in medieval towns is, to put it mildly, not a priority. Most people bathe infrequently, if at all. Water is precious, fuel for heating water is expensive, and the prevailing medical wisdom actually suggests that bathing might be dangerous to one's health. The theory is that hot water opens the pores, making the body vulnerable to disease-carrying bad air. So most people avoid bathing, relying instead on occasionally changing their linen undergarments and hoping for the best. The result is that every person carries their own personal cloud of body odor, intensified by layers of wool and linen clothing that are rarely washed. Sweat, dirt, and the general grime of daily life accumulate in clothing, until the garments themselves become sources of smell. In crowded spaces, churches, markets, alehouses, the combined effect of dozens or hundreds of unwashed bodies creates an atmosphere that's almost physically oppressive. Dental hygiene is virtually non-existent. Toothbrushes won't be invented for centuries, and dental care consists mainly of pulling teeth when they become too painful to bear. The result is that most adults have breath that could knock a person unconscious, and the combination of rotting teeth, infected gums, and general oral decay adds another layer to the personal aromatic experience that defines medieval social interaction. But perhaps the most overwhelming contributor to medieval town smell is the complete absence of any system for dealing with human waste. There are no sewers, no treatment plants, no understanding that human excrement might need to go somewhere other than the nearest convenient location. Instead, waste goes wherever it's most convenient to put it, which usually means the street directly outside one's door. Some towns have public latrines, but these are often just wooden structures built over streams or ditches, allowing waste to flow directly into the local water supply. The waste doesn't disappear, it just moves downstream, where it becomes someone else's problem. These latrines themselves become concentrated sources of smell, attracting flies, rats, and creating toxic clouds of gas that can be overwhelming, even by medieval standards. Night soil men, the people whose job it is to empty private latrines and chamber pots, work in conditions that are almost unimaginable. They carry human waste through the streets in buckets and carts, often spilling as they go, leaving trails of filth that add to the general aromatic landscape. The night soil itself has to go somewhere, and that somewhere is usually just outside the town walls, where it creates massive, festering piles that contribute their own long-range olfactory effects to the surrounding countryside. The cumulative effect of all these individual sources creates something that goes beyond mere smell. It becomes a physical presence, a thick, choking atmosphere that seems to have weight and substance. Medieval writers, when they describe their towns at all, often mention the air itself as something that has to be endured, survived, rather than simply breathed. Foreign visitors to medieval towns consistently comment on the overwhelming nature of the smell. Travelers from rural areas, accustomed to the clean air of the countryside, find urban centres almost unbearable. The contrast is so stark that many visitors become physically ill, their bodies unable to adjust to the concentrated assault on their senses. The smell isn't just unpleasant, it's dangerous. The same conditions that create the overwhelming odours also create perfect breeding grounds for disease. Rats, flies, and other disease vectors thrive in the filthy conditions. The contaminated water supplies spread illness throughout the population. The poor sanitation leads to regular outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases that sweep through medieval towns with devastating regularity. But perhaps most remarkably, the people who live in these conditions adapt to them. Humans have an amazing ability to become accustomed to even the most challenging circumstances, and medieval town dwellers develop a tolerance for smells that would incapacitate modern people. What seems overwhelming and unbearable to us was simply the normal background of daily life to them. They develop strategies for coping. Wealthy people carry pomanders, small containers filled with sweet-smelling herbs and spices, to help mask the ambient odours. Others hold scraps of cloth soaked in vinegar or rosewater over their noses when walking through particularly offensive areas. But for most people, adaptation means simply accepting that this is how life smells, and getting on with the business of survival. The smell changes with the seasons, but it never disappears. In spring, when the frozen waste of winter begins to thaw, medieval towns experience what can only be described as an olfactory apocalypse. Months of accumulated filth, preserved in ice and snow, suddenly release their concentrated essence all at once. The streets become rivers of liquid waste mixed with mud, creating a soup of human and animal excrement that squelches and bubbles underfoot. The warming air carries these smells farther, higher, deeper into every building, every room, every corner where people try to live their lives. Spring also brings rain, and rain in a medieval town doesn't wash things clean. Instead, it stirs up the accumulated waste, spreads it around, and creates new combinations of filth. The unpaved streets become streams of liquid mud mixed with decomposing organic matter. The smell becomes mobile, flowing from one part of town to another, seeping into basements, pooling in low-lying areas, and generally ensuring that no one escapes the aromatic consequences of medieval urban planning. Summer brings its own special challenges. The heat intensifies everything. What might have been merely unpleasant in cooler weather becomes overwhelming when temperatures rise. The sun beats down on piles of waste, accelerating decomposition and creating chemical reactions that produce new and even more offensive odors. The air shimmers with heat waves that seem to carry concentrated essence of rot and decay. During the hottest days, the smell becomes almost solid, a physical barrier that people have to push through as they move about their daily business. The combination of heat, humidity, and organic decay creates a greenhouse effect that traps odors close to the ground, concentrating them in the very areas where people live and work. Windows, if they exist, can't be opened, because letting in outside air means letting in the full force of the urban stench. Autumn doesn't bring relief, just different problems. The cooling air traps smells closer to the ground, creating dense layers of odor that settle over the town like a blanket. Fallen leaves mix with the existing waste, adding their own decomposing contribution to the mix. The harvest season brings new waste from food processing, grain storage, and the slaughter of animals that need to be preserved for winter. Blood runs in the streets from butchering operations, mixing with the existing filth to create new and creative combinations of offensive smells. But it's the people's relationship with water that really explains why medieval towns smell so impossibly bad. Water is precious, difficult to obtain, and often dangerous to drink. Most towns are built around a single water source, a river, stream, or well that serves the entire population. This same water source also serves as the town's sewer system, its industrial waste disposal, and its general dumping ground for anything liquid that needs to go somewhere. The logic seems backwards to modern minds, but it made sense to medieval people. Water flows, so waste put into water will flow away and become someone else's problem. The issue is that the water doesn't flow far enough or fast enough to actually remove the waste. Instead, it creates a slow-moving stream of contaminated water that carries waste from the upper parts of town to the lower parts, spreading the smell and the filth throughout the entire urban area. Wells, which should provide clean drinking water, often become contaminated because they're dug too close to latrines, waste pits, or simply because surface runoff carries filth directly into them. The same well that provides drinking water might also receive drainage from nearby houses, workshops, and animal pens. The result is that even the water tastes and smells bad, adding to the general sensory assault that defines medieval urban life. Rivers that flow through towns become open sewers, carrying waste from every source upstream. But rivers don't just carry waste away, they also deposit it. When rivers flood, which they do regularly, they spread contaminated water and waste across the entire town, leaving behind layers of filthy sediment when the water recedes. These flood deposits dry and become sources of smell for months afterward, contributing to the permanent aromatic character of medieval urban areas. The relationship between water and waste creates a cycle that makes the smell problem self-perpetuating. Contaminated water breeds disease, which creates more waste. Sick people produce more bodily waste, which contaminates more water, which spreads more disease. The smell isn't just unpleasant, it's a symptom of a system that's fundamentally broken, where the basic necessities of life, water, and waste disposal have become hopelessly intertwined. Industrial processes make the water problem even worse. Tanners dump their chemical waste directly into streams. Dyers release their colored wastewater, creating rivers that run red, blue, or green, depending on what's being produced upstream. Brewers and distillers dump their spent grain and fermentation waste into the water, adding alcoholic and yeasty smells to the mix. Metalworkers dump their quenching water, hot and full of metal particles and chemicals, directly into the nearest convenient stream. The cumulative effect is that medieval town water doesn't just smell bad, it's actively toxic. The smell is a warning, the body's natural defense system, trying to prevent people from drinking something that might kill them. But when the bad-smelling water is the only water available, people drink it anyway and hope for the best. The result is that waterborne diseases sweep regularly through medieval populations, creating cycles of illness that make the waste problem even worse. But let's talk about the markets, because that's where all these smells come together in a concentrated assault on the senses. Medieval markets are essential to urban life, the places where food, goods and services are exchanged. But they're also ground zero for some of the most overwhelming smells imaginable. Fish markets are particularly notorious, featuring not just fresh fish, but fish in various stages of decomposition, fish waste, fish processing byproducts, and the general aromatic contributions of an industry that deals with large quantities of rapidly rotting protein. Fish don't last long without refrigeration, and medieval preservation methods, salting, smoking, and drying, create their own powerful smells. The combination of fresh fish, rotting fish, salt, smoke, and the waste products from fish processing creates an olfactory experience that can be detected from considerable distances. Fish blood runs in streams through market areas, attracting flies, rats, and other scavengers that add their own contributions to the sensory assault. Meat markets face similar challenges, but with even more dramatic results. Large animals are often butchered on site, creating rivers of blood and piles of offal that have to go somewhere. The somewhere is usually just outside the market area, where it joins the general pile of urban waste. The smell of fresh blood mixed with rotting meat scraps creates a combination that's both metallic and organic, sharp and sweet, overwhelming and inescapable. Vegetable markets might seem like they'd smell better, but rotting vegetables create their own special problems. Spoiled produce ferments, creating alcoholic smells mixed with the sour, vinegar-like odors of decomposition. Cabbage, onions, and other strong-smelling vegetables add their own contributions even when fresh. When they rot, they create combinations of smells that are uniquely offensive, sharp, and penetrating in ways that seem designed to clear sinuses and water eyes. The people who work in these markets adapt to the smells through necessity, but their adaptation comes at a cost. Their clothing absorbs the odors of their trade, making them walking advertisements for their profession. A fishmonger can be identified by smell alone, even when they're far from their workplace. Butchers carry the metallic smell of blood and the sweet stench of decay. Vegetable sellers smell like fermentation and compost. These occupational smells create a social hierarchy based partly on aromatic acceptability. People who work with pleasant-smelling materials, bakers when they're actually baking, spice merchants, perfume makers, are more socially acceptable than those who work with offensive materials. The smell becomes a mark of social class, with the wealthy able to afford occupations and living situations that don't require them to be constantly surrounded by offensive odors. But even the wealthy can't escape the general aromatic atmosphere of medieval urban life. Their houses might be better built, with more space between them and the worst sources of smell, but they still share the same air, the same water supply, the same basic urban infrastructure that creates the problem in the first place. Wealth can provide some insulation from the worst effects, but it can't provide complete escape. The wealthy develop elaborate strategies for dealing with the smell problem. Their houses feature gardens filled with sweet-smelling herbs and flowers, designed to create pockets of pleasant air within the general urban miasma. They burn incense and aromatic woods to mask odors. They employ servants whose job it is to change rushes more frequently, empty chamber pots more regularly, and maintain higher standards of cleanliness. But these strategies only work within the confines of their own properties. Step outside, and the wealthy face the same olfactory assault as everyone else. The smell is democratic in its reach, affecting rich and poor alike, though the rich have more resources for coping with it. The church plays an interesting role in the medieval smell economy. Churches are often the largest, most substantial buildings in town, and they serve as refuges from the worst of the urban odours. The practice of burning incense during religious services creates pockets of sweet-smelling air that provide temporary relief from the external assault on the senses. The smell of frankincense and myrrh becomes associated with cleanliness, purity, and divine presence, partly because it's such a stark contrast to the normal urban atmosphere. But churches also contribute to the problem in their own ways. Medieval churches often serve as burial grounds, with bodies interred directly beneath the floor or in adjacent graveyards. The decomposition of human remains adds its own contribution to the local aromatic landscape. Church graveyards become sources of smell, especially during warm weather when decomposition accelerates. The contrast between the sweet smell of incense inside the church and the general stench outside becomes part of the religious experience. The church offers not just spiritual salvation, but also temporary sensory relief. A few minutes of breathing air that doesn't assault the nose and throat. This sensory contrast reinforces the idea that the church represents purity and cleanliness in a world that's fundamentally dirty and corrupt. Religious festivals and processions take on additional meaning in this context. When the entire population gathers for religious observances, the concentration of unwashed bodies creates an almost overwhelming olfactory experience. The procession routes become corridors of intensified human smell, as hundreds or thousands of people move slowly through the narrow streets, their combined body odour creating clouds of stench that linger long after the procession has passed. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about medieval town smells is how they become part of people's identity, their sense of place and belonging. And people who grow up in these conditions don't just adapt to them, they internalize them. The smell of home becomes literally the smell of home, the familiar mixture of human waste, industrial processes, and urban decay that defines their particular town, their particular neighborhood, their particular life. Travelers can identify different towns by their characteristic smells. Each place has its own unique combination of local industries, local geography, local waste management practices that create a distinctive aromatic signature. A town known for its tanning industry smells different from one known for its brewing. A coastal town with a fishing industry has a different smell profile from an inland agricultural centre. These distinctive smells become part of local pride and identity. People defend their hometown's particular combination of odours as being somehow better, more honest, more authentic than the smells of other places. The smell becomes part of the local culture, something that bonds residents together and distinguishes them from outsiders who can't handle the local aromatic environment. But the smells also serve as barriers to travel and trade. Merchants and travellers often avoid certain towns because of their reputation for overwhelming odours. Some places become known as places you pass through quickly, with minimal stops, because the smell is so overpowering that extended visits become physically unbearable for people not accustomed to the local conditions. This creates a kind of olfactory isolationism, where towns become trapped in their own aromatic bubbles, cut off from outside influence, partly because their smells are so offensive to visitors. The isolation reinforces the local smell culture, making it even more intense and distinctive, which further discourages outside contact. The daily rhythm of medieval urban life is partly organised around the smells. People learn to time their activities to avoid the worst olfactory experiences. They know that certain streets are more offensive at certain times of day, when particular industries are active or when waste removal activities are taking place. They plan their routes through town to minimize exposure to the most overwhelming sources of smell. Markets are visited early in the morning, before the heat of the day intensifies the smells of rotting produce and decomposing meat. Industrial areas are avoided during peak production hours, when the smell of tanning, brewing, or metalworking is at its strongest. Even social activities are planned around the aromatic calendar, with outdoor gatherings scheduled for times when wind patterns might carry the worst smells away from gathering areas. This creates a shadow map of the town, an invisible geography based not on streets and buildings, but on smells and their patterns. People navigate not just by visual landmarks, but by aromatic ones, using their noses to guide them through the urban landscape. The ability to read these smell maps becomes a survival skill, a way of minimizing exposure to the most overwhelming and potentially dangerous odors. And through it all, life goes on. People fall in love, raise children, create art, build businesses, and pursue happiness in conditions that would seem impossible to modern sensibilities. They adapt not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically to an environment that assaults their senses every moment of every day. The smell becomes background, something they notice only when it changes dramatically or when they encounter someone from outside who reacts with shock and horror to their normal environment. The psychology of smell adaptation is perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of medieval urban life. Modern research tells us that humans can become accustomed to almost any odor within about 15 to 20 minutes of continuous exposure. But this adaptation comes with a cost. The same mechanism that allows medieval townspeople to function in their aromatic environment also dulls their ability to detect dangerous changes in smell that might signal disease, spoiled food, or other threats to their health and safety. And children born into these conditions never know anything different. To them, the overwhelming stench that would incapacitate a modern person is simply the normal smell of human civilization. They learn to breathe through their mouths when the air becomes particularly thick. They develop the ability to eat food while surrounded by the smells of decomposition and waste. Their entire sensory relationship with the world is calibrated to an environment that most humans throughout history would find unbearable. This adaptation creates a kind of sensory isolation from the natural world. People who live their entire lives surrounded by the concentrated smells of urban waste lose the ability to appreciate subtler natural odors. The smell of rain on clean earth, the delicate fragrance of wildflowers, the fresh scent of morning air. All of these become foreign experiences, noticed only when someone travels far enough from town to escape the urban aromatic bubble. But the smells don't just affect individuals, they shape entire communities and social structures. Neighborhoods organize themselves around smell patterns, with the wealthy claiming areas upwind from the worst sources of odor, while the poor are relegated to downwind locations where the concentrated stench of the entire town settles like a toxic fog. These aromatic boundaries become social boundaries, reinforcing class divisions and creating physical barriers that are as real as any wall or gate. The concept of public health doesn't exist yet, but the smells create their own crude form of social organization around disease and contamination. People learn to avoid areas where the smell indicates particular danger, gathering places where the concentration of waste and filth creates obvious health risks. But they don't understand the connection between smell and disease in any scientific sense. They simply know that certain places smell worse, and that people who spend time in those places seem to get sick more often. Marriage and courtship become complicated by the aromatic realities of medieval life. Personal smell becomes a significant factor in romantic relationships, but not in the way modern people might expect. Rather than seeking partners who smell pleasant, people seek partners whose particular combination of body odor, occupational smells, and general aromatic presence is compatible with their own. A successful marriage might be one where both partners can tolerate each other's smells during the intimate confines of shared living space. The wealthy have more options for managing their personal aromatic presence, which gives them advantages in social situations. They can afford to change their linen more frequently, to use expensive imported soaps and perfumes, to employ servants who handle the most odoriferous tasks. But even wealth can't completely overcome the basic aromatic realities of medieval urban life. Everyone, rich and poor, carries the smell of their environment with them wherever they go. Professional matchmakers and marriage brokers learn to consider aromatic compatibility along with financial and social factors when arranging marriages. A tanner's daughter might be perfectly suitable for a butcher's son, both families already adapted to working with offensive smells, but she might be completely incompatible with the son of a spice merchant whose family has higher aromatic expectations. Pregnancy and childbirth become particularly challenging in this environment. Pregnant women, whose sense of smell often becomes more acute, find themselves overwhelmed by odors they previously tolerated. Morning sickness is compounded by the constant assault of urban smells, making simple activities like walking to market or attending church physically unbearable. Some wealthy women retreat to country estates during pregnancy, seeking relief from the urban aromatic environment, but most have no choice but to endure. Childbirth itself takes place in rooms that smell of blood, sweat, and bodily fluids, with no understanding that these smells might indicate dangerous levels of contamination. Midwives work in conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals, using instruments and linens that carry the accumulated odors of previous births. The mortality rates for both mothers and infants reflect the reality that the same conditions creating the overwhelming smells are also creating deadly health hazards. Children who survive infancy in these conditions develop immune systems that are either remarkably robust or tragically compromised. Those who adapt successfully can tolerate exposures that would devastate people from cleaner environments. But many don't adapt successfully, succumbing to diseases that thrive in the same conditions that create the overwhelming smells. Education, such as it exists, takes place in buildings that share all the aromatic challenges of other medieval structures. Schools, when they exist at all, are usually single rooms where dozens of unwashed children gather for instruction. The concentration of young bodies, many suffering from poor nutrition and inadequate hygiene, creates its own special aromatic environment. Teachers, usually members of the clergy who have taken vows of poverty, often smell no better than their students. The process of learning to read and write becomes complicated by the physical discomfort of the environment. Concentration is difficult when the air itself seems to have weight and substance. Students learn to focus their attention despite the constant assault on their senses, developing mental discipline partly as a survival mechanism for functioning in an overwhelming aromatic environment. Books and manuscripts, precious and rare, absorb the smells of the places where they're stored and studied. Libraries in monasteries and churches develop their own characteristic odors, combinations of incense, candle wax, and the accumulated smells of centuries of human occupation. The smell of learning becomes literally the smell of old parchment mixed with human habitation, creating associations that persist long after people leave the educational environment. Seasonal festivals and celebrations take on additional complexity in this aromatic context. Large gatherings of people create concentrated smell experiences that can be overwhelming even by medieval standards. Harvest festivals, religious celebrations, and market days bring together hundreds or thousands of people in confined spaces, creating aromatic events that linger in memory, not just for their social significance, but for their overwhelming sensory impact. The preparation of food for these celebrations becomes an exercise in aromatic management. Cooks learn to use strong spices and herbs, not just for flavor, but to mask the smells of ingredients that may not be perfectly fresh. The distinction between seasoning and preservation becomes blurred, with the same techniques serving both culinary and aromatic purposes. Wedding feasts present particular challenges, as they're supposed to be joyful celebrations, but take place in the same aromatic environment that characterizes all medieval social gatherings. The combination of many people in fancy clothing, elaborate food preparation, and the general urban smell creates events that are memorable for all the wrong reasons. Wedding guests learn to position themselves strategically, seeking spots with better air circulation and avoiding areas where the concentration of smells becomes overwhelming. Religious holidays add their own aromatic dimensions to the calendar. Easter celebrations, marking rebirth and renewal, take place in spring when the winter's accumulated waste is beginning to thaw and ferment. Christmas celebrations occur during the coldest part of winter, when people are packed together for warmth in buildings that haven't been properly aired for months. The irony of celebrating spiritual purity and divine love in environments that assault every sense becomes part of the medieval religious experience. The development of trade and commerce is significantly impacted by these aromatic realities. Merchants learn to plan their routes and timing around the smell patterns of different towns and regions. Some goods, particularly food items, become unmarketable if they absorb too much of the local urban odor during storage or transport. The value of goods can be diminished simply by their association with particularly malodorous locations. International trade brings people together from different aromatic environments, creating cultural exchanges that are as much about smell tolerance as about economic negotiation. Merchants from relatively clean rural areas find themselves physically overwhelmed when conducting business in major urban centres. City merchants, accustomed to their local aromatic environment, may find themselves unwelcome in areas where their smell marks them as outsiders. The development of currency and banking is influenced by these realities. Coins and paper money absorb smells from the environments where they circulate. Money that has spent time in particularly odoriferous locations carries those smells with it, creating associations between certain denominations or sources of currency and unpleasant aromatic experiences. Moneylenders and bankers learn to handle currency in ways that minimize their exposure to the accumulated smells of economic circulation. Craftsmanship and artistic creation face unique challenges in this environment. Artists working with materials that absorb odors find their creations permanently marked by the aromatic environment of their creation. Paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects carry with them the smells of the workshops where they were made. A tapestry created in a building next to a tannery will forever carry subtle traces of that industrial process. Musicians and performers must consider the aromatic environment when planning their presentations. Singing becomes more difficult when the air is thick with particulates and offensive odors. Wind instruments require more effort to produce clear tones when the air itself seems to have substance and weight. Audiences, struggling with their own sensory discomfort, may be less receptive to artistic experiences that require sustained attention and concentration. The preservation of cultural traditions becomes complicated by these environmental factors. Storytelling, an important means of preserving history and culture, often takes place in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, where the concentration of human odors makes long gatherings physically challenging. The oral tradition adapts by developing shorter, more intense narrative forms that can be completed before the aromatic environment becomes unbearable for audiences. Dance and physical celebration face similar constraints. Traditional folk dances that might have developed in rural settings with clean air become modified for performance in urban environments where physical exertion in close quarters creates overwhelming concentrations of human smells. The cultural expressions that survive are those that can adapt to the aromatic realities of medieval urban life. Religious practices evolve partly in response to these environmental challenges. The use of incense in religious ceremonies serves not just spiritual purposes, but practical ones, creating temporary pockets of more pleasant air during religious observances. Prayer practices that emphasize meditation and contemplation may partly reflect the need for spiritual techniques that can function despite overwhelming sensory distractions. The concept of pilgrimage takes on additional meaning in this context. The journey from the known aromatic environment of home to the different smells of distant places becomes part of the spiritual experience. Pilgrims often comment not just on the spiritual significance of holy sites, but on the relief of breathing different air, of escaping temporarily from the particular aromatic burden of their home communities. Monasteries and religious communities develop their own approaches to managing aromatic environments. The emphasis on cleanliness in some religious orders reflects not just spiritual symbolism, but practical understanding that better hygiene creates more pleasant living conditions. The gardens cultivated by religious communities serve not just practical and aesthetic purposes, but aromatic ones, providing sources of pleasant smells to counteract the general urban environment. The development of medical practices is profoundly influenced by these aromatic realities. Medieval physicians learned to diagnose illnesses partly through smell, not because they understand the scientific relationship between odor and disease, but because certain smells consistently accompany certain conditions. The smell of a patient becomes part of the diagnostic process, though the understanding of why remains clouded in superstition and incomplete knowledge. Medical treatments often focus as much on managing smells as on addressing underlying health issues. Physicians prescribe aromatic herbs and treatments that mask symptoms rather than cure diseases. The inability to distinguish between correlation and causation means that treatments that happen to smell pleasant are often preferred over those that might be more medically effective, but less aromatic ally acceptable. Surgical procedures, primitive and dangerous, take place in environments where the smells of blood, infection, and human waste create conditions that actively promote the spread of disease. Surgeons work without understanding of sterile technique, in rooms that reek of previous procedures and ongoing infections. The mortality rates reflect not just the primitive state of surgical knowledge, but the impossibly contaminated conditions in which procedures are attempted. The care of the sick and dying becomes complicated by aromatic factors. Families caring for ill relatives must balance the need for close attention with the reality that sickness often intensifies unpleasant smells. The smell of death becomes familiar to everyone, a warning sign that helps people recognize when someone is beyond medical help. But this familiarity with the smell of mortality also creates a psychological burden that affects entire communities. Burial practices reflect these aromatic realities. The speed with which bodies must be buried or otherwise disposed of depends partly on how quickly they begin to contribute to the already overwhelming urban smell environment. Funeral practices develop around the need to manage decomposition as much as to honor the dead. Cemeteries become sources of smell that affect entire neighborhoods, creating zones of intensified odor that influence property values and social patterns. The concept of memorializing the dead becomes complicated when the physical remains create ongoing aromatic challenges for the living. Elaborate tombs and monuments serve partly to contain and control the smells of decomposition, protecting survivors from the olfactory consequences of honoring their departed relatives. The wealthy can afford burial practices that minimize aromatic impact, while the poor must accept that even their deaths will contribute to the general smell problem that affects everyone. Legacy and inheritance take on aromatic dimensions when family businesses involve particularly odoriferous occupations. The son of a tanner inherits not just tools and techniques, but a lifetime of association with overwhelming industrial smells. Family reputations become tied to the aromatic signatures of hereditary occupations, creating social classifications that persist across generations. The development of urban planning, such as it exists, begins to reflect some awareness of smell patterns and their impact on livability. Wealthy districts position themselves upwind from industrial areas. Markets are located in areas where wind patterns might carry away some of the worst odors. But these early attempts at aromatic urban planning are crude and largely ineffective. limited by the fundamental lack of understanding about waste management and public health. The concept of neighborhood identity becomes tied to characteristic smells. Each district of a medieval town develops its own aromatic signature based on the local industries, the local population, and the local geography. People identify their home neighborhoods as much by smell as by visual landmarks. Visitors can navigate through unfamiliar towns, partly by following their noses, using smell patterns to orient themselves in the urban landscape. Property values, though not formalized in modern terms, reflect aromatic realities. Locations with particularly overwhelming smells are occupied by those with no other options. The best locations, relative to medieval standards, are those with access to slightly better air circulation or distance from the worst sources of smell. But even the best locations are still overwhelmed by modern standards, just slightly less unbearable than the worst areas. The daily routine of medieval urban life organizes itself around aromatic patterns. People learn to time their essential activities for moments when the smells are marginally less overwhelming. They develop routes through town that minimize exposure to the worst areas. They cultivate relationships with neighbors who share similar tolerance levels for particular kinds of smells. The rhythm of urban life becomes a careful dance around the ever-present reality of overwhelming odor. And in the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about medieval town smells is how they reveal the extraordinary human capacity for adaptation and survival. People not only endured these conditions, but built civilizations, created art, fell in love, raised families, and found meaning in life, despite environmental challenges that seem almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. The smell that defines medieval urban life isn't just about poor sanitation or primitive technology. It's about the fundamental human struggle to create community and meaning in the face of overwhelming challenges. It's about the price of urban civilization when the basic infrastructure for supporting large populations doesn't yet exist. And it's about the remarkable resilience of people who found ways to live, love, and hope in conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance. The aromatic legacy of medieval towns reminds us that progress isn't inevitable, that the clean air and water we take for granted represent achievements that came at great cost and took centuries to develop. The overwhelming smells of medieval urban life weren't just unpleasant. They were symptoms of a world still learning how to build sustainable communities, still discovering the relationship between human waste and human health, still struggling with the basic challenge of how to live together without poisoning the very air we breathe. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval town smells was how they affected the most vulnerable members of society. Children, the elderly, and the sick bore the heaviest burden of living in these aromatic nightmares. Pregnant women, already struggling with the physical demands of carrying a child in an era of primitive medicine, found their heightened sensitivity to smells turning every day into a battle for basic survival. The nausea that naturally accompanies early pregnancy became magnified into something approaching torture when every breath brought fresh waves of human waste, rotting food, and industrial contamination. Infants born into these conditions faced challenges that began before they drew their first breath. The birthing chambers themselves reeked of blood, sweat, and bodily fluids from previous deliveries. Midwives, working without any concept of sterile technique, brought with them the accumulated smells of their profession. The linens used to wrap newborns carried the odors of countless previous uses, washed in contaminated water, and dried in air thick with urban pollutants. The mortality rates for infants and young children reflected not just the primitive state of medical knowledge, but the reality that the same conditions creating overwhelming smells were also breeding grounds for disease. Babies who survived their first few weeks still face the challenge of developing in an environment where every surface, every breath of air, every drop of water carried the potential for contamination. Childhood development took place against this aromatic backdrop. children learned to walk on streets slick with waste and mud. They learned to speak in air so thick with particulates that clear pronunciation became a challenge. Their play areas were the same spaces used for waste disposal, food preparation, and industrial work. The games they invented, the songs they sang, the stories they told, all developed within the context of an environment that assaulted their senses from birth. Educational development, for the few children who received any formal schooling, occurred in buildings that shared all the aromatic challenges of other medieval structures. Monastery schools and cathedral schools provided the only formal education available, but these institutions existed within the same urban environment as everything else. Children attempting to learn their letters did so while breathing air thick with incense, candle smoke, and the accumulated odours of centuries of human occupation. The psychological impact of growing up in such conditions is difficult to measure, but it shaped entire generations. Children who never experienced clean air or pure water developed different expectations about what constituted normal living conditions. Their sensory development adapted to an environment that would overwhelm most humans, but this adaptation came at a cost. The subtle sensory experiences that might have enriched their emotional and intellectual development were lost beneath the overwhelming assault of urban smells. Adolescence brought new challenges as young bodies developed in this toxic environment. The hormonal changes of puberty, already difficult under the best circumstances, became complicated by living conditions that made personal hygiene nearly impossible. Young people navigating the social complexities of emerging adulthood did so while managing the aromatic realities that affected every human interaction. The elderly faced their own unique struggles with medieval urban smells. Bodies weakened by age and illness became more sensitive to environmental assaults. Respiratory conditions, already common due to poor nutrition and primitive medicine, were exacerbated by constant exposure to polluted air. The smell of approaching death, which became familiar to everyone in medieval communities, marked the final chapter of lives spent breathing contaminated air. But the impact extended beyond individual human suffering to affect the very structure of medieval society. Social hierarchies organized themselves partly around aromatic realities. The wealthy, who could afford homes with better ventilation and distance from the worst sources of smell, occupied a literally different aromatic environment from the poor. This created not just economic divisions, but sensory ones, where different social classes inhabited fundamentally different olfactory worlds within the same urban space. Professional guilds developed their own aromatic cultures. Bakers, working with yeast and flour, inhabited a different smell universe from tanners, who worked with urine and decomposing flesh. These occupational aromas became so distinctive that people could identify professions by smell alone. A person's occupation determined not just their income and social status, but their daily aromatic experience and their acceptance in different social circles. The guild system itself reflected these aromatic realities. Trades that involved particularly offensive smells were often relegated to specific districts or required to operate under special regulations. Tanneries, for example, were frequently banned from city centres and forced to operate in peripheral areas where their smell would affect fewer people. But in smaller towns, where space was limited, these aromatic boundaries couldn't be maintained, creating ongoing conflicts between different trades and residential areas. Marriage negotiations took aromatic compatibility into account, though rarely explicitly. Families arranging marriages considered not just financial and social factors, but the practical reality of whether two people could tolerate each other's occupational and personal smells during intimate cohabitation. A successful marriage might depend as much on mutual aromatic tolerance as on affection or economic advantage. The legal system began to reflect aromatic concerns as medieval towns grew larger and more complex. Early attempts at urban regulation included ordinances about waste disposal, not because authorities understood public health principles, but because citizen complaints about overwhelming smells created social unrest. These primitive sanitation laws were usually ineffective, lacking both enforcement mechanisms and alternative solutions for waste management. Court proceedings themselves took place in environments that challenged everyone involved. Judges, lawyers, and witnesses gathered in buildings that shared the same aromatic problems as other urban structures. The administration of justice occurred in air thick with human odors, making lengthy trials physically uncomfortable for everyone involved. The smell of the courtroom itself became part of the experience of seeking legal remedy. Property disputes sometimes centered around aromatic issues. Neighbors sued each other over waste disposal practices that created overwhelming smells. Landlords and tenants argued about responsibility for managing human waste and industrial odors. These legal conflicts reflected the reality that smell had become a significant factor in determining property values and living conditions. Commercial law evolved to address aromatic realities affecting trade and commerce. Merchants developed contracts that included provisions about goods damaged by exposure to overwhelming urban smells. Insurance concepts, primitive as they were, began to account for losses caused by aromatic contamination of valuable merchandise. The smell of a town could literally affect its economic prospects by deterring trade and commerce. Religious institutions played complex roles in managing aromatic challenges. Churches served as temporary refuges from the worst urban smells, their incense and careful maintenance creating pockets of more pleasant air. But religious institutions also contributed to the problem through their own waste disposal needs and burial practices. The irony of seeking spiritual purification in buildings surrounded by overwhelming physical contamination became part of the medieval religious experience. Monastic communities developed some of the most sophisticated approaches to managing aromatic environments. Their emphasis on cleanliness and order reflected not just spiritual symbolism, but practical understanding that better hygiene created more pleasant living conditions. Monastery gardens served multiple purposes, providing food, medicine, and sources of pleasant smells to counteract urban contamination. Religious festivals created their own aromatic challenges and opportunities. Processions through town streets concentrated hundreds of unwashed bodies in confined spaces, creating overwhelming smell experiences. But these same events also featured elaborate use of incense and aromatic herbs, creating temporary improvements in air quality that became associated with divine intervention and spiritual purification. The theological implications of living in such aromatic conditions influenced medieval religious thought. The contrast between the foul smells of earthly existence and the imagined sweet fragrances of heaven became a powerful metaphor for spiritual transformation. Religious texts and sermons drew explicit connections between physical cleanliness and spiritual purity, though practical application of these principles remained limited by technological and economic constraints. Pilgrimage took on additional meaning as an escape from familiar aromatic environments. Travelers journeying to holy sites experienced not just spiritual renewal, but sensory relief from the particular smell burdens of their home communities. The aromatic landscape of pilgrimage routes became part of the spiritual journey, with different regions offering different sensory experiences that enhance the sense of traveling toward divine encounter. The development of medical knowledge was profoundly shaped by aromatic realities. Medieval physicians learned to use smell as a diagnostic tool, not because they understood the scientific relationship between odor and disease, but because certain smells consistently accompanied certain conditions. The breath of patients, the smell of their urine, the odors emanating from wounds and infections all became part of primitive diagnostic procedures. Treatment practices reflected the reality that managing smells often took priority over addressing underlying health issues. Physicians prescribed aromatic herbs and compounds that masked symptoms rather than cured diseases. The pleasant smell of a treatment became evidence of its effectiveness, regardless of its actual medical value. This confusion between aromatic acceptability and therapeutic efficacy shaped medical practice for centuries. Surgical procedures, dangerous and primitive, took place in environments where overwhelming smells indicated the presence of exactly the contamination that made surgery so deadly. Surgeons worked in rooms that reeked of blood, pus, and gangrenous tissue from previous operations. The mortality rates reflected not just crude surgical techniques, but the impossibly contaminated conditions in which procedures were attempted. The care of the chronically ill created ongoing aromatic challenges for families and communities. Diseases that involved suppuration, gangrene, or bowel disorders created smells so overwhelming that they affected entire neighborhoods. The social isolation of the seriously ill reflected not just fear of contagion, but the practical reality that some conditions created aromatic environments that were unbearable for healthy people. Mental illness presented particular aromatic challenges in a world that didn't distinguish between different types of health problems. People suffering from depression, anxiety, or other psychological conditions often neglected personal hygiene, adding to the general aromatic burden of their communities. The social stigma attached to mental illness was reinforced by the offensive smells associated with people who couldn't maintain even minimal cleanliness standards. The treatment of mental illness, such as it existed, often focused more on managing the aromatic consequences than addressing underlying psychological issues. Restraints and confinement were used partly to contain people whose behavior included poor hygiene practices that created overwhelming smells. The association between mental illness and offensive odors became so strong that smell itself was sometimes considered evidence of psychological problems. Seasonal variations in urban smells created cyclical challenges that affected entire communities. Spring brought the aromatic apocalypse of thawing waste, creating temporary conditions so overwhelming that normal urban activities became nearly impossible. Summer intensified all odors through heat and humidity, creating aromatic experiences that tested human endurance. Autumn brought new waste from harvest processing and food preservation activities. Winter offered some relief through freezing, but also created problems when people crowded together in poorly ventilated spaces for warmth. Weather patterns became crucial factors in urban livability. Wind direction determined which neighborhoods would bear the heaviest aromatic burdens on any given day. Rain didn't wash streets clean, but instead stirred up accumulated waste and spread it around, creating mobile aromatic disasters that moved through urban areas like slow-motion storms. Humidity trapped smells close to the ground, creating dense layers of odor that seemed to have physical weight. Climate change, though not understood in modern terms, affected aromatic patterns in ways that medieval people noticed and adapted to. Longer, hotter summers intensified decomposition and made urban smells more overwhelming. Unpredictable weather patterns disrupted traditional waste management practices, such as they were, creating new aromatic challenges that communities struggled to address. The development of urban planning, primitive as it was, began to reflect awareness of aromatic patterns and their impact on livability. Wealthy districts positioned themselves upwind from industrial areas and waste disposal sites. Market locations were chosen partly based on wind patterns that might carry away some of the worst odors. But these early attempts at aromatic urban planning were crude and largely ineffective, limited by fundamental misunderstanding of waste management principles. Neighborhood identity became tied to characteristic smell patterns. Each district developed its own aromatic signature based on local industries, population density, and geographic features. People navigated through urban areas, partly by following aromatic landmarks, using smell patterns to orient themselves in familiar and unfamiliar towns. The ability to read these smell maps became a survival skill for urban residents. Property development reflected aromatic realities in ways that influenced urban growth patterns. Areas with particularly overwhelming smells remained underdeveloped or became occupied only by those with no other options. The best locations, relative to medieval standards, were those with slightly better air circulation or greater distance from major sources of contamination. But even the most desirable urban locations were overwhelmingly malodorous by any reasonable standard. The economic impact of urban smells extended beyond immediate health and comfort issues to affect long-term urban development. Towns with reputations for particularly overwhelming odors found it difficult to attract skilled craftsmen, merchants, and other residents who could contribute to economic growth. The aromatic environment became a factor in determining which communities thrived and which remained stagnant or declined. Trade relationships were affected by aromatic realities in ways that influenced regional economic development. Merchants learned to time their visits to avoid the worst aromatic seasons in different towns. Some goods became unmarketable if they absorbed too much local urban odor during storage or transport. The smell of a town could literally determine its commercial prospects by affecting the willingness of outside traders to conduct business there. Currency and banking were influenced by these aromatic realities in ways that seem almost surreal from modern perspectives. Coins and primitive paper money absorbed smells from the environments where they circulated. Money that had spent time in particularly odoriferous locations carried those smells with it, creating associations between certain sources of currency and unpleasant aromatic experiences. Moneylenders and early bankers learned to handle currency in ways that minimized their exposure to these accumulated odors. The development of insurance concepts, primitive as they were, began to account for losses caused by aromatic contamination of valuable goods. Merchants developed contracts that included provisions about merchandise damaged by exposure to overwhelming urban smells. The economic risk of aromatic damage became a factor in commercial calculations, affecting pricing, insurance, and trade route planning. International commerce brought together people from different aromatic environments, creating cultural exchanges that were as much about smell tolerance as about economic negotiation. Merchants from relatively clean rural areas found themselves physically overwhelmed when conducting business in major urban centers. City merchants, accustomed to their local aromatic environment, might find themselves unwelcome in areas where their accumulated smells marked them as undesirable outsiders. The preservation of goods for long-term storage or transport became complicated by aromatic concerns. Food products, textiles, and other valuable items could be rendered worthless by exposure to overwhelming urban odors. Storage facilities had to balance protection from theft and weather with the need to prevent aromatic contamination. The development of preservation techniques reflected these concerns, with methods chosen as much for their ability to prevent aromatic damage as for their effectiveness in preventing spoilage. Craftsmanship and artistic creation faced unique challenges in environments where overwhelming smells affected both creators and their materials. Artists working with materials that absorbed odors found their creations permanently marked by the aromatic environment of their creation. Paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects carried with them the smells of the workshops where they were made, creating unintended aromatic signatures that became part of their identity. The development of artistic techniques reflected these environmental constraints. Painters learned to work with materials and methods that could function despite overwhelming aromatic distractions. Sculptors chose materials partly based on their resistance to absorbing offensive odors. Musicians and performers had to consider aromatic environments when planning presentations, knowing that audiences struggling with sensory discomfort might be less receptive to artistic experiences. Literary culture, such as it existed, was affected by aromatic realities in ways that influenced the development of written expression. Scribes and scholars worked in environments that shared all the aromatic challenges of other medieval buildings. Libraries and scriptoriums, precious repositories of knowledge, developed their own characteristic odors from centuries of human occupation mixed with incense, candle smoke, and the accumulated smells of manuscript production. The preservation of written materials became complicated by aromatic concerns. Books and manuscripts absorbed the smells of the environments where they were stored, creating aromatic associations that became part of the reading experience. The smell of learning became literally the smell of old parchment mixed with human habitation, creating sensory memories that persisted long after people left educational environments. Educational practices adapted to aromatic realities in ways that affected the development of learning and scholarship. Students attempting to concentrate on complex intellectual tasks did so while managing constant sensory assault from overwhelming environmental odors. Teaching methods evolved to account for the physical discomfort of educational environments, with shorter lessons and more active engagement designed to help students maintain focus despite aromatic distractions. The development of literacy was affected by these environmental factors. Learning to read and write required sustained concentration and attention to detail, both of which were challenged by constant exposure to overwhelming smells. The association between education and physical discomfort may have contributed to limited literacy rates, as the aromatic environment of learning made intellectual pursuits physically uncomfortable for many people. Cultural transmission, the process by which knowledge and traditions passed from one generation to the next, was complicated by aromatic environmental factors. Storytelling and oral tradition often took place in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, where the concentration of human odors made long gatherings physically challenging. Cultural practices adapted by developing shorter, more intense forms that could be completed before aromatic environments became unbearable for participants. The development of entertainment and recreational activities reflected these environmental constraints. Traditional celebrations, festivals, and social gatherings had to account for the reality that bringing many people together in confined spaces created overwhelming concentrations of human smells. Entertainment forms evolved to function despite these challenges, with outdoor activities preferred when weather permitted, and indoor events structured to minimize aromatic overload. Social customs and etiquette developed around aromatic realities in ways that influenced interpersonal relationships and community dynamics. People learned to position themselves strategically during social interactions, seeking spots with better air circulation and avoiding areas where smell concentrations became overwhelming. The ability to tolerate and navigate aromatic challenges became part of social competence, affecting people's ability to participate fully in community life. The concept of hospitality was complicated by aromatic concerns. Welcoming guests into one's home meant exposing them to the family's particular aromatic environment, while also subjecting the family to whatever smells the guests brought with them. Social visiting required mutual tolerance of aromatic differences that could be significant even within the same community. The duration and frequency of social visits were often limited by aromatic tolerances rather than social preferences. Marriage and family formation were affected by aromatic realities in ways that influenced the most intimate aspects of human relationships. Courtship rituals had to account for the reality that close personal contact meant exposure to each other's aromatic presence. Successful marriages required not just emotional and economic compatibility, but also mutual tolerance of aromatic differences that would be intensified by intimate cohabitation. Family life unfolded within aromatic environments that affected every aspect of domestic experience. Child-rearing took place in conditions where overwhelming smells were simply part of the background of daily life. Children learned social norms and family traditions while breathing air that would incapacitate most modern people. The aromatic environment of the home became part of family identity and cultural transmission. The care of elderly family members created particular aromatic challenges as aging bodies became less able to maintain personal hygiene. Families balanced obligations to care for elderly relatives with the reality that age-related health issues often intensified unpleasant smells. The social dynamics of extended family living were affected by these aromatic realities, influencing decisions about living arrangements and care responsibilities. Death and dying occurred within these same aromatic environments, adding the smells of mortality to the already overwhelming sensory landscape. The process of caring for terminally ill family members required tolerance of smells that indicated approaching death. Funeral practices developed partly around the need to manage the aromatic consequences of death while honoring the deceased and supporting surviving family members. Burial customs reflected aromatic concerns as much as religious or social traditions. The speed with which bodies had to be buried or otherwise disposed of was determined partly by how quickly they began to contribute to the already overwhelming urban smell environment. Cemetery locations were chosen partly based on wind patterns and drainage considerations that might minimize the aromatic impact on surrounding residential areas. The development of memorial practices was complicated by aromatic realities. Elaborate tombs and monuments served partly to contain and control the smells of decomposition, protecting survivors from the olfactory consequences of honoring their departed relatives. The wealthy could afford burial practices that minimized aromatic impact, while the poor had to accept that even their deaths would contribute to the general smell problems affecting entire communities. Legacy and inheritance took on aromatic dimensions when family businesses involved particularly odoriferous occupations. Children inheriting family trades also inherited lifetime associations with specific industrial smells. Family reputations became tied to the aromatic signatures of hereditary occupations, creating social classifications that persisted across generations and influenced opportunities for social mobility. The intergenerational transmission of aromatic tolerance became part of family culture. Children born into families with particularly challenging occupational smells developed higher tolerance levels than those from families with less aromatic ally demanding trades. These differences in aromatic adaptation created subtle social divisions that affected marriage prospects, social interactions, and community integration. And so, the great aromatic tapestry of medieval urban life wove itself through every aspect of human existence, touching every relationship, every activity, every moment of daily life. The overwhelming smells that characterized these communities weren't just background discomfort, but active forces that shaped social structures, economic relationships, cultural practices, and individual human development in ways that continue to seem almost incomprehensible from modern perspectives. The resilience of people who not only survived, but thrived in these conditions speaks to fundamental human capacities for adaptation and community building that transcend environmental challenges. They created meaningful lives, built lasting institutions, produced art and literature, and maintained hope for the future despite living in conditions that tested the very limits of human sensory tolerance. The aromatic legacy of medieval towns serves as a reminder that the clean air and water we take for granted represent achievements that came at great cost and took centuries to develop. The overwhelming smells of medieval urban life weren't just unpleasant inconveniences, but symptoms of communities still learning how to support large populations without poisoning their own environments. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about these medieval aromatic environments is how they reveal the extraordinary human capacity to find meaning, create beauty, and build civilization, even in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Yet it wasn't just the overwhelming presence of these smells that defined medieval urban existence. It was how they moved, how they shifted and flowed through the narrow streets like invisible rivers of stench, carrying with them the stories of everyone and everything they touched. The wind wasn't just wind in a medieval town. It was a carrier of aromatic news, bringing messages from every corner of the community, whether you wanted to receive them or not. On still days, when no breeze stirred the air, the smells settled into layers like sediment in a pond. The heaviest odors, thick with moisture and particulate matter, hugged the ground where people walked and worked. Above that, lighter smells floated in invisible strata, creating a vertical geography of stench that changed, as you moved up or down through the urban landscape. Climb to an upper floor of a building, and you might escape the heaviest street-level odors only to encounter the accumulated smells of cooking, human habitation, and whatever industrial processes operated at that height. When wind did blow, it didn't bring relief. Instead, it stirred the aromatic layers, mixing them into new combinations that could be even more overwhelming than the settled smells of still air. A breeze from the direction of the tanners would carry their particular blend of decomposing flesh and urine throughout the town. Wind from the butcher's quarter brought the metallic sweetness of blood and the sick smell of rotting meat scraps. Air flowing over the residential areas carried the concentrated essence of hundreds of unwashed bodies, overflowing chamber pots, and domestic waste. The medieval nose became a sophisticated instrument of urban navigation, capable of detecting subtle variations in smell that indicated changes in weather, season, or local conditions. People learned to read the wind like a map, understanding what each shift in air currents would bring to their particular corner of town. They developed strategies for timing their activities around these aromatic weather patterns, venturing outside when the wind carried the worst smells away from their roots, staying indoors when atmospheric conditions concentrated the stench around their homes. Seasonal changes brought dramatic shifts in the aromatic landscape that affected entire communities. Spring wasn't just the season of renewal and growth. It was the season of the great thaw, when months of frozen waste suddenly released their concentrated essence all at once. The first warm days of spring created aromatic explosions that could be detected miles away as winter's accumulated filth began to decompose in earnest. The ground itself seemed to exhale months of held breath, releasing clouds of stench that made the air shimmer with their intensity. Summer brought its own aromatic calendar. The heat didn't just intensify existing smells, it transformed them, creating chemical reactions that produced entirely new odors. Waste that might have been merely unpleasant in cooler weather became actively toxic in the summer sun. The combination of high temperatures, humidity, and organic decomposition created aromatic storms that rolled through medieval towns like weather systems, building to overwhelming peaks before gradually subsiding, only to build again as new waste was added to the festering mix. The longest days of summer were often the worst, when extended daylight hours meant extended exposure to heat-intensified smells. People learned to structure their daily routines around these aromatic peaks, rising before dawn to complete essential tasks before the day's heat transformed their environment into something approaching unbearable. The siesta, that afternoon rest period adopted in some regions, wasn't just about escaping the heat. It was about escaping indoors during the peak aromatic hours, when the combination of temperature and accumulated waste created atmospheric conditions that challenged human endurance. Autumn brought different but equally challenging aromatic experiences. The harvest season meant processing large quantities of food, generating massive amounts of organic waste that joined the existing urban stench. Apple pressings, grape pomace, grain chaff, and vegetable trimmings created new layers of smell that fermented and rotted alongside the permanent background odors. The shorter days meant less time for natural air circulation to disperse these new additions, creating concentrated pockets of seasonal stench that lingered in the cooler air. Winter offered some relief through freezing, but created its own unique problems. When waste froze, it stopped actively decomposing, but it also stopped flowing. Frozen piles of filth accumulated in streets and courtyards, building into ice-hard mounds that would release their contents in aromatic floods when spring temperatures returned. The cold air held smells differently, sometimes trapping them in dense, low-lying clouds that seemed to have physical weight and substance. Indoor heating during winter months created new aromatic challenges. Houses sealed against the cold became concentrated chambers of human smell, with no fresh air circulation to dilute the accumulating odors of daily life. Families crowded together for warmth shared not just body heat, but the full aromatic impact of unwashed bodies, cooking food, and human waste in confined spaces. The smell of winter indoors was different from summer outdoor stench, but equally overwhelming in its own suffocating way. The rhythm of medieval urban life organized itself around these aromatic patterns in ways that seem almost incomprehensible from modern perspectives. People didn't just tolerate the overwhelming smells, they internalized them, building their daily routines, their social customs, their very sense of normal life around aromatic realities that would incapacitate visitors from cleaner environments. Work schedules reflected aromatic considerations as much as practical ones. Certain trades could only be practiced during specific weather conditions, when wind patterns carried their particular smells away from residential areas. Tanners might find their work restricted during still air conditions, when their industrial odors became too overwhelming for surrounding neighborhoods to tolerate. Butchers learned to time their slaughtering activities for days when wind direction would carry blood smells away from market areas where customers needed to conduct business. Market days created their own aromatic events that affected entire communities. The concentration of people, animals, food, and commercial activity in confined spaces generated smell experiences that were memorable for reasons no one wanted to remember. Vendors learned to position themselves strategically, seeking locations with better air circulation while avoiding areas where competing smells might overwhelm their own merchandise. Customers developed shopping strategies that minimized exposure to the most offensive stalls, while ensuring they could complete necessary purchases before the aromatic overload became unbearable. The social dynamics of market interactions were affected by aromatic realities in ways that influenced economic relationships. Bargaining and negotiation became more hurried when conducted in overwhelming smell environments. The ability to tolerate aromatic discomfort became an economic advantage, allowing some traders to operate in conditions that drove away competition. Market success sometimes depended as much on smell tolerance as on business acumen. Religious observances took on additional layers of meaning in these aromatic contexts. Church services provided temporary escape from the worst urban smells through the use of incense and the generally better ventilation of larger buildings. But they also concentrated hundreds of unwashed bodies in confined spaces, creating their own overwhelming aromatic experiences. The contrast between the sweet smell of incense and the general stench of the congregation became part of the sensory experience of worship, reinforcing ideas about spiritual purification and divine transcendence. Holy days and religious festivals created community-wide aromatic events that tested everyone's tolerance. Processions through town streets brought together crowds of people whose combined smell created moving clouds of stench that lingered long after the religious observance had ended. The association between religious celebration and overwhelming human odor became so strong that some people avoided large religious gatherings, not for spiritual reasons, but simply because the aromatic experience was unbearable. The development of religious architecture reflected awareness of these aromatic challenges. Churches were built with higher ceilings and better ventilation, not just for acoustic reasons, but to help disperse the concentrated smells of large congregations. The placement of windows, doors, and ventilation openings in religious buildings showed sophisticated understanding of airflow patterns and their impact on aromatic environments. Monastery communities, with their emphasis on discipline and order, developed some of the most advanced approaches to managing aromatic environments. Their rules about cleanliness, waste disposal, and community hygiene reflected not just spiritual symbolism, but practical understanding that better sanitation created more pleasant living conditions. The contrast between monastery environments and typical urban conditions was so stark that it reinforced ideas about religious life, representing a higher form of human existence. The medieval relationship with death was profoundly shaped by aromatic realities. The smell of approaching death became so familiar that it served as a diagnostic tool, helping families recognize when someone was beyond medical help. But this familiarity with the aromatic signatures of mortality created psychological burdens that affected entire communities. The smell of death wasn't just unpleasant, it was a constant reminder of human frailty and the temporary nature of all earthly existence. Funeral practices developed around the need to manage the aromatic consequences of death while maintaining social and religious customs. The speed of burial was determined not just by religious requirements, but by how quickly decomposition began to affect surrounding areas. Funeral processions became exercises in aromatic management, with mourners positioning themselves to minimize exposure to the smell of the deceased while still participating in required observances. Cemetery management became one of the most challenging aspects of medieval urban planning. Graveyards, necessary for religious and social reasons, created ongoing aromatic problems for surrounding neighborhoods. The placement of burial grounds reflected attempts to balance religious requirements with practical needs to minimize the impact of decomposition smells on residential areas. But in crowded urban environments, these compromises were often inadequate, leaving entire neighborhoods permanently affected by the aromatic consequences of mortality. The concept of memory and commemoration took on different meanings in environments where the physical remains of the dead created ongoing sensory experiences for the living. Memorial practices had to account for the reality that honoring the deceased meant accepting the aromatic consequences of decomposition. Elaborate tombs and monuments served partly as barriers to contain and control the smells of death, protecting survivors from the olfactory impact of their memorial practices. Family relationships were tested by the aromatic realities of caring for aging and dying relatives. The smell of serious illness, of bodies failing and systems shutting down, became part of the intimate experience of family love and obligation. People learned to express affection and maintain emotional connections despite overwhelming sensory assault. The ability to provide care, regardless of aromatic challenges, became a measure of family loyalty and human decency. Inheritance and family continuity were affected by aromatic considerations in ways that influenced property values and family planning decisions. Houses that had been sites of prolonged illness or death carried aromatic memories that affected their desirability for future occupants. Family businesses involving particularly odorous trades faced challenges in attracting successors who could tolerate the aromatic demands of hereditary occupations. The development of medical knowledge was shaped by aromatic realities in fundamental ways. Medieval physicians learned to use smell as their primary diagnostic tool, not because they understood the scientific relationship between odor and disease, but because aromatic patterns consistently accompanied different medical conditions. The breath of patients, the smell of their urine and bodily waste, the odors emanating from wounds and infections all became part of diagnostic procedures that were surprisingly sophisticated within their aromatic framework. Treatment practices reflected the reality that managing smells often took priority over addressing underlying health issues. Physicians prescribed aromatic herbs and compounds that masked symptoms rather than cured diseases. The pleasant smell of a treatment became evidence of its effectiveness, regardless of its actual therapeutic value. This confusion between aromatic acceptability and medical efficacy shaped healing practices in ways that persisted for centuries. Surgical procedures, dangerous and primitive as they were, took place in aromatic environments that actively promoted infection and complications. Surgeons worked in rooms that reeked of blood, pus, and gangrenous tissue from previous operations. The instruments they used carried the smells of countless procedures, becoming aromatic repositories of surgical history. The mortality rates associated with medieval surgery reflected not just primitive techniques, but the impossibly contaminated aromatic environments in which procedures were attempted. The care of chronic conditions created ongoing aromatic challenges that affected entire families and neighborhoods. Diseases involving suppuration, gangrene, or digestive disorders produced smells so overwhelming that they created social isolation for sufferers and their families. The stigma associated with certain medical conditions was intensified by their aromatic consequences, creating barriers to social participation that extended far beyond the medical symptoms themselves. Mental health, though not understood in modern terms, was affected by aromatic environments in ways that medieval people recognized without fully comprehending. The constant assault of overwhelming smells created stress, anxiety, and depression that compounded other mental health challenges. People suffering from psychological conditions often neglected personal hygiene, adding to their social isolation and reinforcing negative associations between mental illness and offensive odors. The treatment of mental health problems, such as it existed, often focused more on managing aromatic consequences than addressing underlying psychological issues. Restraints and confinement were used partly to contain people whose mental state led to poor hygiene practices that created overwhelming smells. The association between psychological problems and offensive odors became so strong that smell itself was sometimes considered evidence of mental instability. Women faced particular challenges in managing personal hygiene and aromatic acceptability within the constraints of medieval urban life. Menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth all created aromatic experiences that had to be managed within social systems that provided few resources for feminine hygiene. The smell of women's biological functions became entangled with ideas about femininity, purity, and social acceptability in ways that affected women's participation in community life. Pregnancy brought heightened sensitivity to smells at the worst possible time. Women carrying children found themselves overwhelmed by odors they had previously tolerated, making simple activities like shopping, attending church, or socializing physically unbearable. The nausea that naturally accompanies early pregnancy was magnified by constant exposure to urban stench, creating health challenges that affected both mothers and their developing children. Childbirth took place in aromatic environments that would horrify modern medical professionals. The birthing chamber filled with the smells of blood, amniotic fluid, and bodily waste, while midwives worked with instruments and linens that carried the aromatic history of previous deliveries. The mortality rates for both mothers and infants reflected the reality that the same conditions creating overwhelming smells were also creating deadly health hazards. Child rearing occurred within these aromatic contexts in ways that affected human development from the earliest stages of life. Infants born into environments of overwhelming smell developed differently than those raised in cleaner conditions. Their sensory systems adapted to aromatic assault, but this adaptation came at costs that affected their entire lives. The psychological and physical development of children raised in such conditions reflected the reality that smell wasn't just background discomfort, but an active force shaping human growth and development. Educational opportunities, limited as they were, occurred within the same aromatic constraints that affected all other aspects of medieval life. The few children who received formal schooling did so in buildings that shared the aromatic challenges of other urban structures. Learning to read and write required sustained concentration that was challenged by constant sensory assault. The association between education and physical discomfort may have contributed to limited literacy rates and restricted educational opportunities. The preservation of knowledge and cultural traditions was affected by aromatic realities in ways that influenced the development of human civilization itself. Libraries and scriptoriums, precious repositories of written knowledge, developed their own characteristic smells from centuries of human occupation, mixed with the materials and processes of manuscript production. The aromatic environment of learning became so distinctive that the smell of books and scholarship carried associations that persisted long after people left educational settings. Cultural transmission through oral tradition was complicated by aromatic environmental factors that affected community gatherings and storytelling practices. Long recitations of traditional tales, songs, and histories had to be structured around the reality that bringing many people together in confined spaces created overwhelming concentrations of human smells. Cultural practices adapted by developing shorter, more intense forms that could be completed before aromatic environments became unbearable for participants. The development of artistic expression was shaped by aromatic realities that affected both creators and audiences. Musicians performing in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces had to adapt their techniques to account for air quality that made sustained performance challenging. Audiences struggling with sensory discomfort were less able to appreciate subtle artistic expressions that required focused attention and emotional engagement. Visual arts faced their own aromatic challenges, as artists worked with materials that absorbed and held the smells of their creation environments. Paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects carried with them the aromatic signatures of the workshops where they were made. The smell of art became literally the smell of the places where it was created, creating unintended sensory associations that became part of the aesthetic experience. The development of technology and craftsmanship was influenced by aromatic considerations that affected both working conditions and final products. Craftsmen learned to adapt their techniques to function, despite overwhelming aromatic distractions. The quality of finished goods reflected not just technical skill, but the ability to maintain standards of workmanship while managing constant sensory assault. Innovation in manufacturing processes was sometimes driven by aromatic concerns, as much as efficiency considerations. Techniques that reduced offensive smells were adopted even when they didn't improve product quality or reduce costs. The aromatic impact of different manufacturing methods became a factor in technological development that influenced the evolution of medieval industry. Trade relationships were affected by aromatic realities that extended far beyond immediate health and comfort concerns. Merchants learned to evaluate potential trading partners, partly based on their aromatic tolerance and the smell environments of their home communities. Commercial relationships that might have been profitable were sometimes avoided because the aromatic challenges of conducting business in certain locations made trade impractical. The development of currency and banking systems was influenced by aromatic realities in ways that seem almost surreal from modern perspectives. Coins absorbed smells from the environments where they circulated, carrying aromatic information about their origins and history. Money that had spent time in particularly odoriferous locations became less desirable, affecting its practical value in commercial transactions. International commerce brought together people from different aromatic environments, creating cultural exchanges that were as much about smell adaptation as economic negotiation. Successful international merchants developed extraordinary aromatic tolerance that allowed them to function in any smell environment they might encounter during their travels. This aromatic adaptability became a professional skill that was as valuable as language abilities or commercial knowledge. The emergence of urban planning, primitive as it was, reflected growing awareness of aromatic patterns and their impact on community livability. The placement of different districts within towns began to account for wind patterns, drainage, and other factors that influenced smell distribution. But these early attempts at aromatic urban planning were limited by fundamental misunderstandings about waste management and public health principles. Property development and real estate values, though not formalized in modern terms, reflected aromatic realities that influenced urban growth patterns. Areas with the most overwhelming smells remained underdeveloped or became occupied only by those with no other options. The most desirable locations were those with slightly better air circulation or greater distance from major sources of contamination, though even the best areas were overwhelmingly malodorous by any reasonable standard. Legal systems began to reflect aromatic concerns as medieval communities grew larger and more complex. Early urban regulations included ordinances about waste disposal, not because authorities understood public health principles, but because citizen complaints about overwhelming smells created social unrest. These primitive sanitation laws were usually ineffective, lacking both enforcement mechanisms and alternative solutions for waste management problems. Property disputes sometimes centered around aromatic issues that created ongoing conflicts between neighbors. Legal proceedings themselves took place in aromatic environments that made lengthy trials physically uncomfortable for everyone involved. The administration of justice occurred in air thick with human odors, adding sensory discomfort to the stress and uncertainty of legal processes. The development of social customs and etiquette reflected aromatic realities that influenced interpersonal relationships and community dynamics. People learned elaborate strategies for managing social interactions despite overwhelming sensory challenges. The ability to maintain courtesy and social grace while managing aromatic discomfort became a mark of sophistication and social competence. Hospitality customs had to account for the reality that welcoming guests meant exposing them to the host family's particular aromatic environment, while also subjecting the hosts to whatever smells the visitors brought with them. Social visiting required mutual tolerance of aromatic differences that could be significant even within the same community. The duration and frequency of social visits were often limited by aromatic considerations rather than social preferences. Marriage negotiations and family formation were affected by aromatic realities that influenced the most intimate aspects of human relationships. Successful marriages required not just emotional and economic compatibility, but also mutual tolerance of aromatic differences that would be intensified by close cohabitation. Courtship rituals had to account for the reality that intimate personal contact meant full exposure to each other's aromatic presence. The concept of privacy took on different meanings in environments where smell carried information about personal activities across considerable distances. What people did in the supposed privacy of their homes became public knowledge through aromatic evidence that traveled through thin walls and open windows. Personal secrets became difficult to maintain when the smells of private activities announced themselves to entire neighborhoods. Community solidarity was both strengthened and strained by shared aromatic experiences. People who endured the same overwhelming smell environments developed bonds of mutual understanding and support. But the constant stress of sensory assault also created tensions and conflicts that affected community relationships. The ability to maintain social cooperation despite overwhelming environmental challenges became a measure of community strength and resilience. And so, the aromatic tapestry of medieval urban life wove itself through every fiber of human existence, touching every relationship, every institution, every moment of daily experience in ways that shaped the very foundations of human civilization. The overwhelming smells that characterize these communities weren't just environmental challenges to be endured. They were active forces that influenced social development, economic relationships, cultural expression, and individual human development in ways that continue to seem almost incomprehensible from modern perspectives. The remarkable resilience of people who not only survived, but created meaningful lives in these conditions speaks to fundamental human capacities for adaptation and community building that transcend environmental constraints. They built lasting institutions, created art and literature, developed sophisticated social systems, and maintained hope for better futures, despite living in aromatic conditions that tested the very limits of human sensory tolerance. The legacy of medieval urban smells serves as a powerful reminder that the clean environments we take for granted represent achievements that required centuries of development and came at enormous cost in human suffering and social struggle. The overwhelming aromatic assault of medieval town life wasn't just an unfortunate side effect of primitive technology. It was a symptom of communities still learning how to support large populations without destroying the very environments that sustain them. But perhaps most remarkably, these aromatic environments reveal the extraordinary human capacity to find meaning, create beauty, and build civilization even under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The people who lived in these overwhelming smell environments didn't just survive, they thrived, creating the foundations of modern urban civilization while breathing air that would incapacitate most contemporary humans. Their legacy reminds us that human resilience and adaptability extend far beyond what we might think possible, and that the progress we celebrate today was built on the extraordinary endurance of people who found ways to live fully human lives despite environmental conditions that challenge our very understanding of what humans can tolerate and overcome. In the end, the story of medieval town smells is really the story of human civilization itself, struggling to learn how to live together in large numbers without poisoning the very air we breathe, the water we drink, and the earth that sustains us all. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of medieval urban aromatic life was how it shaped the very concept of hope and aspiration. In a world where every breath carried the concentrated essence of human waste, industrial contamination, and organic decay, the idea of improvement, of progress, of a better future took on meanings that are difficult for modern minds to grasp. Hope wasn't about achieving comfort or pleasantness. It was about enduring, about surviving one more day without succumbing to the overwhelming sensory assault that defined every moment of existence. Children growing up in these environments developed different relationships with the concept of aspiration itself. When the normal background of life included smells that would incapacitate visitors from cleaner regions, the very definition of success became recalibrated. A good day wasn't one that smelled pleasant. It was one that smelled no worse than usual. Achievement wasn't measured by aromatic improvement, but by aromatic tolerance, by the ability to function despite conditions that challenge the basic human capacity for sensory processing. The wealthy, despite their advantages, couldn't escape these fundamental realities. They could afford better locations, more frequent changes of clothing, servants to handle the most odorous tasks, and imported materials to mask offensive smells. But wealth couldn't purchase clean air when the entire urban atmosphere was contaminated. The rich breathed the same basic air as the poor, just with slightly more pleasant additions layered on top of the fundamental stench that characterized all medieval urban environments. This created a peculiar form of social equality through shared suffering. No matter how much money you had, how many servants you employed, how elaborate your attempts at aromatic mitigation, you still shared the basic sensory experience that defined urban life. The smell was democratic in its reach, touching everyone regardless of social status, economic position, or political power. Kings and peasants alike breathed air that carried the concentrated essence of human waste, industrial contamination, and organic decay. The psychological adaptation required to function in these environments created personality traits and mental frameworks that shaped entire cultures. People learned to compartmentalize their sensory experiences, to mentally separate the overwhelming aromatic assault from their emotional and intellectual lives. This ability to function despite constant sensory distress developed into cultural values that emphasized endurance, stoicism, and acceptance of harsh realities as fundamental aspects of human existence. Religious and philosophical systems that emerged from these environments reflected the mental adaptations necessary for survival. Concepts of spiritual transcendence, of rising above earthly concerns, of finding meaning beyond physical comfort, all took on immediate practical relevance for people whose daily existence included sensory experiences that modern humans would find unbearable. The ability to maintain spiritual focus despite overwhelming physical discomfort became not just a religious ideal, but a survival skill. The development of aesthetic sensibilities was profoundly influenced by these aromatic realities. Beauty became defined not by pleasant sensory experiences, but by the absence of overwhelming unpleasantness. Artistic appreciation developed in people whose sensory systems were constantly managing aromatic assault, creating aesthetic frameworks that emphasized visual and auditory beauty, partly as compensation for the complete absence of pleasant olfactory experiences. Music, poetry, and visual arts that emerged from these environments carried unique characteristics shaped by the sensory context of their creation. Artists, working while breathing air thick with human waste and industrial contamination, developed forms of expression that reflected both the harsh realities of their environment and their determination to create beauty despite overwhelming sensory challenges. The contrast between artistic beauty and environmental horror became a defining characteristic of medieval cultural production. Literary works that survive from this period often completely ignore the aromatic realities that dominated daily life, creating a form of cultural denial that allowed people to imagine and discuss worlds where smell wasn't a constant source of distress. This selective attention to pleasant or neutral sensory experiences in artistic expression served as psychological escape from environments that offered no actual physical relief from sensory assault. The concept of romance and courtly love developed in contexts where intimate personal contact meant full exposure to aromatic realities that challenged the very possibility of physical attraction. Love poetry that emphasized spiritual connection, emotional bonds, and idealized beauty partly reflected the practical necessity of finding ways to maintain romantic feelings despite aromatic circumstances that would seem to make physical intimacy impossible. Marriage ceremonies and wedding celebrations occurred within the same aromatic contexts that characterized all medieval social gatherings. The most important moments of people's lives, the ceremonies meant to mark love, commitment, and new beginnings, took place while everyone involved breathed air thick with the smells of human waste, unwashed bodies, and industrial contamination. The ability to focus on emotional and spiritual significance despite overwhelming sensory distraction became an essential skill for meaningful participation in life's most important moments. Family relationships developed within aromatic environments that tested every bond. Parents caring for children, spouses living in intimate proximity, extended families sharing confined living spaces, all had to maintain emotional connections while managing constant exposure to each other's most offensive bodily smells. The strength of family ties was literally tested by aromatic tolerance, by the willingness to continue loving and caring despite sensory experiences that challenged basic human comfort. Child development occurred within these aromatic contexts in ways that affected every aspect of human growth and learning. Children's games, songs, stories, and social interactions all took place while breathing air that would overwhelm most modern adults. Their cognitive development, emotional growth, and social learning happened despite constant sensory assault that would seem to make concentration and attention impossible. Educational processes, limited as they were, had to account for the reality that learning occurred in environments where the air itself seemed to have weight and substance. Students attempting to memorize prayers, learn letters, or acquire practical skills did so while managing aromatic distractions that would challenge even the most focused modern minds. The development of memory techniques and learning strategies reflected these environmental constraints, with methods designed to function despite overwhelming sensory interference. The preservation of knowledge and cultural traditions required extraordinary mental discipline from people whose sensory systems were constantly managing aromatic assault. Scribes copying manuscripts, teachers reciting lessons, storytellers maintaining oral traditions, all had to maintain focus and accuracy while breathing air that challenged basic cognitive function. The survival of medieval learning and culture represents a triumph of human determination over environmental obstacles that seem almost insurmountable. Professional training and skill development occurred within these same aromatic contexts. Apprentices learning trades had to master complex techniques while managing sensory experiences that would distract and overwhelm modern learners. The quality of medieval craftsmanship reflects not just technical skill, but extraordinary mental discipline. The ability to maintain precision and attention to detail despite constant aromatic distraction. Innovation and technological development were affected by aromatic realities that influenced both the process of discovery and the practical application of new knowledge. Inventors and craftsmen working in environments of overwhelming smell had to develop new techniques and tools while managing sensory assault that would seem to make careful observation and precise manipulation impossible. The technological achievements of medieval civilization represent remarkable human adaptability and determination. Trade and commerce required extraordinary aromatic tolerance from merchants who had to conduct business while managing sensory experiences that challenged basic communication and negotiation. Commercial relationships developed between people whose every interaction occurred against a background of overwhelming smell. The ability to maintain business focus despite aromatic distraction became an essential commercial skill that separated successful merchants from those who couldn't adapt to the aromatic realities of medieval trade. The development of legal and governmental systems occurred within aromatic environments that affected every aspect of administration and justice. Courts, councils, and official proceedings all took place in buildings that shared the aromatic challenges of other medieval structures. The administration of justice and governance required extraordinary mental discipline from officials who had to maintain focus on complex legal and political issues while breathing air that challenged basic cognitive function. International diplomacy and political relationships were affected by aromatic realities that influenced every aspect of formal interaction between different communities. Ambassadors and political representatives had to conduct sensitive negotiations while managing aromatic environments that could overwhelm even experienced travelers. The ability to maintain diplomatic courtesy despite sensory assault became an essential political skill that affected relationships between different regions and kingdoms. Military organization and warfare were profoundly influenced by aromatic realities that affected every aspect of armed conflict. Soldiers living in camps, marching through territories, and fighting battles all had to maintain military discipline while managing aromatic experiences that would challenge modern military units. The logistics of medieval warfare included aromatic considerations that affected troop morale, combat effectiveness, and strategic planning. The development of medical and healing practices occurred within aromatic contexts that profoundly influenced both diagnosis and treatment. Physicians working in environments of overwhelming smell had to develop diagnostic techniques that could function despite aromatic interference, while treating patients whose conditions often involved additional offensive odors. Medical knowledge that emerged from these environments reflected both remarkable observational skills and extraordinary sensory tolerance. Surgical procedures and medical treatments took place in aromatic environments that actively promoted infection and complications. The survival rates for medieval medical interventions reflected not just primitive techniques, but the impossibly contaminated sensory environments in which healing was attempted. Medical practitioners who achieved any success at all demonstrated extraordinary skill and determination in overcoming environmental obstacles that seem almost designed to prevent effective healthcare. The care of the sick and dying occurred within aromatic contexts that added sensory assault to the emotional stress of medical crisis. Families caring for ill relatives had to maintain loving attention while managing smell experiences that indicated disease progression and approaching death. The ability to provide compassionate care despite overwhelming aromatic distress became a measure of human decency and family loyalty that tested the fundamental bonds of human relationship. Public health, though not understood in modern terms, was profoundly affected by aromatic realities that influenced disease transmission and community health outcomes. The same conditions that created overwhelming smells also created perfect breeding grounds for the diseases that swept regularly through medieval populations. The aromatic environment served as an early warning system for health threats. though medieval people lacked the scientific understanding to interpret these aromatic signals effectively. Epidemic diseases that periodically devastated medieval communities were often preceded and accompanied by changes in the aromatic environment that reflected the underlying conditions promoting disease transmission. The smell of illness, death, and social breakdown became part of the sensory experience of epidemic crisis, creating aromatic memories that persisted long after the medical emergency had passed. The development of community resilience and mutual support systems was profoundly influenced by aromatic realities that created shared experiences of sensory endurance. Communities that survived epidemic disease, environmental crisis, and social upheaval did so partly through collective aromatic tolerance, through the shared ability to maintain social cooperation, despite overwhelming sensory assault that would seem to make community life impossible. Seasonal celebrations and religious festivals created concentrated aromatic experiences that tested community bonds while marking important cultural moments. The most significant celebrations of medieval life occurred within aromatic contexts that challenged everyone's sensory tolerance, while supposedly representing joy, renewal, and spiritual transcendence. The ability to find meaning and celebration, despite overwhelming aromatic distress, became an essential cultural skill that defined community identity and cohesion. The relationship between individual survival and community cooperation was mediated by aromatic realities that affected every aspect of social interaction. People had to balance their own sensory comfort with social obligations, finding ways to participate in community life, despite aromatic experiences that challenged individual tolerance. The social contracts that held medieval communities together required extraordinary mutual aromatic tolerance and acceptance. Economic systems and resource distribution were influenced by aromatic realities that affected both individual productivity and community wealth creation. Workers in particularly odorous occupations required higher compensation or social support to maintain their essential contributions to community welfare. The aromatic burden of different occupations became a factor in economic calculations that influenced wages, working conditions, and social status. The development of social hierarchies and class systems was influenced by aromatic realities that created additional barriers between different economic groups. The wealthy could afford some protection from the worst aromatic environments, while the poor had no choice but to live and work in conditions of overwhelming sensory assault. These aromatic inequalities reinforced other forms of social stratification and created additional obstacles to social mobility. Cultural identity and community belonging were shaped by aromatic realities that created shared sensory experiences among people who lived in the same environments. The particular smell signature of each community became part of local identity, creating aromatic bonds that connected residents while distinguishing them from outsiders. The ability to tolerate and adapt to local aromatic conditions became a marker of community membership and cultural belonging. The concept of home and belonging took on unique meanings in environments where the most familiar and comforting aspects of place were aromatic signatures that would overwhelm visitors from other locations. People developed emotional attachments to aromatic environments that would seem to make emotional connection impossible, finding comfort and security in smell patterns that represented familiarity and belonging despite their overwhelming intensity. Migration and population movement were profoundly affected by aromatic realities that created barriers to relocation and adaptation. People who attempted to move from one aromatic environment to another faced not just economic and social challenges, but fundamental sensory adaptation requirements that could take months or years to achieve. The aromatic signature of home became a form of cultural baggage that travelers carried with them and had to overcome when attempting to establish new lives in different aromatic environments. The preservation of cultural memory and historical tradition was influenced by aromatic realities that created powerful sensory associations with past events and experiences. Important historical moments became remembered not just through visual and auditory memories, but through aromatic associations that triggered recall of specific times and places. The smell of particular seasons, celebrations, or crises became part of collective memory that persisted across generations. Intergenerational relationships and cultural transmission were mediated by aromatic realities that affected how knowledge, values, and traditions passed from older to younger community members. Grandparents sharing wisdom with grandchildren did so while both generations managed aromatic experiences that would challenge modern family interactions. The ability to maintain meaningful intergenerational connection despite overwhelming sensory distraction became an essential aspect of cultural continuity. The development of personal identity and individual character occurred within aromatic contexts that profoundly influence personality formation and psychological development. People growing up in environments of overwhelming smell developed different relationships with their own bodies, their physical environment, and their sensory experiences than those raised in cleaner conditions. These aromatic influences on personality development created cultural characteristics that persisted across generations and influenced entire civilizations. And through all of this overwhelming aromatic assault, life continued with a persistence and determination that reveals the extraordinary depths of human resilience and adaptability. People fell in love, raised children, created art, built businesses, maintained friendships, and pursued happiness in environments that would seem to make meaningful life impossible. Their ability to find joy, meaning, and connection despite sensory conditions that challenge the very foundations of human comfort speaks to fundamental aspects of human nature that transcend environmental circumstances. The aromatic legacy of medieval urban life serves as both a reminder of how far human civilization has progressed and a testament to the extraordinary resilience of people who built the foundations of modern society while breathing air that would incapacitate most contemporary humans. Their struggles with overwhelming sensory assault created the knowledge, institutions, and cultural frameworks that eventually led to the cleaner environments we now take for granted. But perhaps most importantly, the story of medieval aromatic endurance reveals that human meaning and purpose don't depend on comfortable circumstances or pleasant environments. People who lived their entire lives breathing air thick with human waste and industrial contamination still found ways to love, learn, create, and hope. Their example reminds us that the capacity for meaningful life extends far beyond what we might think possible, and that human dignity and purpose can flourish even under conditions that seem designed to crush the human spirit. The smells that overwhelmed medieval towns weren't just environmental challenges to be endured. They were the aromatic signature of human civilization, learning to support large populations, developing the technologies and social systems that would eventually create cleaner environments, building the foundations of progress through extraordinary endurance and determination. Every breath taken in those overwhelming aromatic environments was a small act of resistance against despair, a quiet affirmation that human life and human community were worth preserving, despite conditions that tested the very limits of what humans could tolerate and survive. In the end, the overwhelming stench of medieval towns tells us as much about human hope and resilience as it does about primitive sanitation and environmental contamination. It reminds us that our ancestors didn't just survive impossible conditions, they thrived in them, creating the civilization we inherited while breathing air we couldn't imagine tolerating for even a single day. And yet, as we reach the end of this aromatic journey through medieval urban life, perhaps the most profound realization is how these overwhelming sensory experiences shaped the very foundations of human progress. The people who endured these conditions weren't just surviving day to day. They were unknowingly building the knowledge, developing the social systems, and creating the technological innovations that would eventually lead humanity away from these aromatic nightmares towards something approaching the clean environments we know today. Every medieval craftsman who learned to work despite overwhelming stench was developing techniques that would eventually improve. Every merchant who built trade relationships while managing sensory assault was creating commercial networks that would grow into cleaner, more efficient systems. Every family that maintained love and care despite aromatic challenges was preserving the human bonds that would carry civilization forward into better times. The physicians who learned to diagnose illness partly through smell, primitive as their understanding was, were developing the observational skills that would eventually evolve into modern medicine. The urban planners who began to consider wind patterns and waste flow, inadequate as their solutions were taking the first steps toward understanding public health and environmental management. The religious leaders who used incense to create pockets of pleasant air were experimenting with aromatic intervention that would eventually inform more sophisticated approaches to environmental improvement. Even the social customs that developed around aromatic tolerance, the etiquette that allowed people to interact despite overwhelming sensory challenges, the community cooperation that enabled survival in impossible conditions. All of these represented early forms of the social contracts and cultural frameworks that would eventually support cleaner, healthier urban environments. The children who grew up breathing air thick with waste and contamination, who developed extraordinary aromatic tolerance as a survival mechanism, were also developing the mental discipline, the sensory adaptability, and the community loyalty that would enable future generations to tackle the enormous challenges of improving urban sanitation and environmental health. Their extraordinary endurance wasn't just individual heroism, it was collective preparation for the long, difficult work of building better cities and cleaner lives. The aromatic memories preserved in medieval communities, the collective understanding of which smells indicated danger, which seasons brought the worst challenges, which weather patterns offered temporary relief. All of this represented a form of environmental knowledge that would eventually contribute to more sophisticated understanding of public health and urban planning. The sensory experiences that seemed like nothing but suffering were also education, preparing humanity for the scientific and technological breakthroughs that would eventually address these problems. The merchants who learned to navigate different aromatic environments during their travels were developing the cultural adaptability and environmental awareness that would eventually support larger, more complex trade networks operating under better sanitary conditions. The international connections forged despite overwhelming sensory challenges were creating the global relationships that would eventually facilitate the sharing of knowledge about sanitation, medicine, and urban planning across different regions and cultures. The religious and philosophical systems that helped people find meaning despite overwhelming aromatic assault were developing the spiritual and intellectual frameworks that would eventually support the long-term thinking, the intergenerational planning, and the collective commitment necessary for major environmental improvements. The ability to maintain hope and purpose despite immediate sensory suffering was preparing cultures for the centuries-long effort required to build truly clean urban environments. The artistic and literary traditions that emerged from these aromatic contexts, the music and poetry and visual arts created by people breathing contaminated air, were preserving and transmitting the cultural values, the aesthetic sensibilities, and the human aspirations that would eventually motivate and guide environmental improvement efforts. Beauty created despite overwhelming ugliness was establishing the standards and expectations that would eventually demand better living conditions. The family relationships maintained despite aromatic challenges, the marriages that survived sensory assault, the parent-child bonds preserved through overwhelming environmental stress. All of these were maintaining the human connections and social structures that would eventually support the community cooperation necessary for major sanitation improvements. Love that persisted, despite impossible conditions, was creating the social capital that would eventually fund and implement better urban systems. The educational traditions preserved despite overwhelming aromatic interference, the knowledge transmitted from generation to generation by people whose concentration was constantly challenged by sensory assault, the skills and techniques passed down through apprenticeship systems operating in contaminated environments. All of this was maintaining the intellectual continuity that would eventually produce the scientific and technological breakthroughs necessary for environmental improvement. And so, the overwhelming stench of medieval towns, horrible as it was, unbearable, as it seems to modern sensibilities, was also the aromatic signature of human civilization in its most determined and resilient phase. Every breath taken in those impossible conditions was a small victory of human persistence over environmental obstacles. Every day survived was proof that human communities could endure and even thrive under conditions that would seem to make civilized life impossible. The people who lived through these aromatic ordeals weren't just victims of primitive sanitation and technological limitations. They were heroes of human endurance whose extraordinary tolerance and determination created the foundation for everything that came after. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It was the price paid for the slow, difficult development of the knowledge and systems that would eventually create cleaner environments for their descendants. The medieval urban smell experience reminds us that progress isn't inevitable, that clean air and water represent achievements earned through centuries of human effort and sacrifice. The overwhelming aromatic assault that characterized medieval town life wasn't just an unfortunate historical accident. It was a necessary phase in humanity's long struggle to learn how to live together in large numbers without destroying the environments that sustain us. But most importantly, the story of medieval aromatic endurance reveals that human dignity, meaning, and purpose don't depend on comfortable circumstances. People who spent their entire lives breathing air that would incapacitate most modern humans still found ways to love deeply, think clearly, create beauty, and build lasting institutions. Their example reminds us that the capacity for meaningful life, for genuine happiness, for profound human connection, extends far beyond what we might imagine possible. The overwhelming stench of medieval towns was real, it was horrible, and it shaped every aspect of human existence in ways that challenge our understanding of what people can endure and overcome. But it was also temporary, a phase in humanity's long journey toward better conditions, cleaner environments, and more sustainable ways of living together. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep breathing clean air, drinking pure water, and living in conditions that would seem miraculous to medieval urban dwellers, remember that these comforts represent the accumulated achievements of countless generations who endured the impossible, who maintained hope despite overwhelming challenges, and who never stopped working towards something better for their children and their children's children. Their legacy lives on not just in the cleaner cities we've inherited, but in the fundamental human qualities they developed through necessity, the patience required to function despite constant sensory assault, the mental discipline needed to concentrate on complex tasks while breathing contaminated air, the social cooperation essential for community survival in impossible conditions, the emotional resilience that allowed people to find joy and meaning despite overwhelming environmental challenges. These weren't just survival skills. They were the character traits that enabled humanity to tackle the enormous multi-generational project of environmental improvement. The same determination that allowed medieval people to wake up every morning and face another day of aromatic assault was the determination that eventually built sewage systems, developed water treatment plants, and created the public health infrastructure we now take for granted. The same community solidarity that held medieval neighborhoods together despite overwhelming smell was the solidarity that eventually supported the collective investment in sanitation improvements. The same adaptability that allowed people to function in impossible aromatic conditions was the adaptability that enabled societies to implement new technologies and change ancient practices when better solutions became available. The same hope that allowed parents to raise children in environments of overwhelming stench, believing somehow that life was still worth living and the future might be better, was the hope that sustained the centuries-long effort to actually make that future better. The aromatic nightmares of medieval urban life weren't just endured. They were overcome, slowly, deliberately, through the accumulated efforts of countless individuals who refused to accept that these conditions were permanent or inevitable. And so, as the night grows quiet and the modern world settles into sleep around you, breathing air that our ancestors could never have imagined, remember that you are the beneficiary of one of humanity's greatest collective achievements. The conquest of the overwhelming stench that once defined urban life wasn't accomplished by heroes or kings or great inventors working alone. It was accomplished by ordinary people, generation after generation, who endured the impossible while slowly, patiently building something better. The medieval towns that once reeked of human waste and industrial contamination eventually became the foundations of the clean cities where millions now live in comfort and health. The aromatic nightmares that tested the very limits of human endurance eventually gave way to environments where the air itself doesn't assault the senses, where water runs clean, where waste disappears into systems designed to protect rather than contaminate. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It took centuries of gradual improvement, of small innovations building upon each other, of communities slowly learning better ways to manage the fundamental challenges of urban life. But it did happen, and it happened because people who lived in conditions we can barely imagine never stopped believing that something better was possible. Tonight, as you rest in air that doesn't carry the concentrated essence of human suffering, as you close your eyes without worrying about the aromatic assault that tomorrow will bring, remember that this peace was earned through the extraordinary endurance of people whose names we'll never know, whose individual stories were lost to time, but whose collective achievement surrounds us still. The overwhelming stench of medieval towns has faded into history, but the human qualities that enabled people to survive and transcend those conditions live on in every clean breath we take, in every glass of pure water we drink, in every moment of sensory comfort we enjoy without even thinking about it. Their aromatic nightmare became our foundation for something better. Their impossible endurance became our inheritance of hope. Sleep well then, knowing that tomorrow you'll wake to air that doesn't tell stories of desperation and decay. You'll step outside into a world where the morning breeze carries the scent of rain and growing things rather than the concentrated essence of human misery. You'll breathe without thinking, drink without fear, and move through spaces designed for comfort rather than mere survival. The medieval townspeople who endured those aromatic ordeals couldn't have imagined such a world. To them, clean air was as fantastical as flying, pure water as mythical as unicorns. They lived their entire lives believing that overwhelming stench was simply the price of civilization, that cities must necessarily reek of waste and decay, that breathing itself must always be an act of endurance rather than simple, unconscious pleasure. Yet even in their darkest, most overwhelming moments, something in the human spirit refused to accept that these conditions were permanent. Parents still sang lullabies to children despite the air that made their eyes water. Lovers still found ways to express tenderness despite personal odors that would horrify modern sensibilities. Artists still created beauty despite working in atmospheric conditions that would defeat contemporary creativity. This refusal to surrender hope, this quiet insistence that life contained meaning beyond mere survival, this stubborn belief that tomorrow might somehow be better than today, these weren't just admirable qualities. They were the seeds of every improvement that followed. Every sewage system, every water treatment plant, every public health innovation grew from the soil of that medieval determination to endure and somehow transcend. The aromatic legacy of those ancient towns lives on, not in museum displays or history books, but in every breath of clean air we take for granted. Each morning, when we wake without our senses being assaulted, each glass of clear water we drink without hesitation, Each moment we move through our environment, without having to navigate invisible rivers of stench, we're living inside the dreams of people who couldn't have imagined such simple, profound luxuries. So rest now, in air that whispers of nothing more troubling than the turning of seasons. Close your eyes, in a world where smell has returned to its proper role, carrying messages of flowers and bread and rain, rather than the accumulated suffering of humanity, learning to live together. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the overwhelming stench that once defined civilization has faded into memory, conquered not by heroes or kings, but by countless ordinary people who refused to believe that the aromatic nightmare would last forever. Their endurance became our inheritance. Their impossible hope became our everyday reality. And in the quiet of this clean, sweet night, that may be the most remarkable victory of all.